Dale walked up to the gates at Windsor that afternoon looking for an easy target and a few thousand views. He left in the back of a police car with a broken nose, a caution he didn't fully understand, and a video that would later be played against him in a courtroom. By the end of this story, you'll see the exact moment he understood what he was actually standing in front of, and you'll see that by the time he understood it, it was already far too late. Before we get into it, if you like these stories, do me a favor and hit subscribe. It honestly helps more than you'd think. Now let's go back to that gray October afternoon. The crowd outside Windsor Castle was thin that day. It was cold, the kind of cold that gets into your hands, and a fine drizzle kept coming and going. Tourists came in small groups, took their photos, and moved on quickly to get back into the warm. There was a school party near the wall, maybe 20 children in matching high-vis vests and a few older couples in raincoats. It was quiet, ordinary, the sort of afternoon nobody expects to remember. The soldier on duty stood in his box near the gate. He wore the long gray winter coat and the bearskin, and his rifle rested against his shoulder. He didn't move. He didn't look at anyone in particular. People walked up, stood beside him for a photo, made the usual jokes about him being a statue, and walked away again. He had heard all of it before. None of it touched him. You could have walked past him 100 times and seen nothing but a man in a uniform doing a boring job in the rain. That was the point. That was exactly the point. Then Dale arrived. You heard him before you saw him. He had a loud voice, and he used it the way some men use their fists, to take up space and make everyone look. He was big, taller than most of the men around, with broad shoulders and a heavy build that he was clearly proud of. He had a phone in one hand and his mate Jordan beside him, and Jordan was already filming. That was the whole plan, really. Dale had decided that today he was going to make a video. He'd seen clips online of people winding up the guards, getting in their faces, trying to make them flinch or laugh or react. Those clips got views. Dale wanted views. He wanted to be the one who finally cracked one of these famous statues, and he'd convinced himself it would be easy. The guard couldn't touch him, could he? The guard just had to stand there. All Dale had to do was be louder and braver than the bloke in the funny hat, and the internet would do the rest. He pushed through the small crowd without saying "excuse me." A woman with a pram had to pull back to let him by. One of the children near the wall stepped behind their teacher. Dale didn't notice or didn't care. His eyes were on the soldier. Right then, he said to Jordan, grinning, "Watch this." He walked straight up to the box and planted himself in front of the guard, closer than anyone had been all day. He looked the soldier up and down like he was sizing up a piece of furniture. "All right, big man," Dale said. "Nice hat." Nothing. The guard's eyes stayed fixed on a point somewhere past Dale's shoulder, on the road and the wall and the gray sky behind him. He didn't blink at the insult. He didn't tense. He simply was not part of Dale's conversation, and that, more than anything, was what started to bother Dale. He leaned in a little. "I'm talking to you, mate. You deaf. You actually deaf under there." Still nothing. Jordan laughed behind the camera, that nervous laugh you do when you're not sure if something is funny or about to go wrong. Dale had expected something. A look, a twitch, a tightening of the jaw, anything he could turn into a moment. Getting nothing felt like being ignored, and Dale hated being ignored more than almost anything in the world. His whole life had been built on people paying attention to him because they were a little bit afraid of him. He had learned young that if you were big enough and loud enough, people gave you room and gave you what you wanted and never asked too many questions. It had worked at school. It had worked in pubs. It had worked on the doors and in the car parks and everywhere Dale had ever decided to throw his weight around. This man wasn't giving him room. This man was giving him absolutely nothing, and it was as if Dale didn't exist at all. "Come on then," Dale said, louder now, playing to the camera. "Say something. You're meant to be hard, aren't you? Bet you're soft as anything under there. Bet you've never had a proper scrap in your life, standing about in a dress with a toy gun." A few of the tourists had stopped to watch now, not because it was interesting yet, but because it was uncomfortable and people slow down for things that feel like they might go wrong. A father quietly turned his small daughter around and walked her a few steps further off. The teacher with the school party moved her group closer to the wall and started counting heads. The soldier hadn't moved an inch, but if you were close and you knew what to look for, you'd have seen one small thing. His eyes, fixed on that far point, flicked once briefly to Dale's hands, just for a fraction of a second, then back to the road. He was reading him, not afraid of him, not annoyed by him. Reading him the way you read a dog you're not sure about, watching the hands and the weight and the shoulders to know what's coming before it comes. Dale didn't see it. He was too busy enjoying his own voice. "What's your name then, eh?" Dale went on. "Bet it's something soft. Bet your mates back at the barracks take the mick out of you. Standing here all day getting your photo taken. That's not a job, mate. That's a costume." There's a thing that happens to certain men when they aren't getting a reaction. They don't back off. They escalate. They take the silence personally, and they keep pushing harder and harder, looking for the line, because the line is the only thing that will finally make them feel real. Dale was that kind of man. The quiet was a wall, and he had decided he was going to get over it one way or another in front of the camera, no matter what it took. So he did the thing you should never do. He reached out and shoved the soldier's shoulder. It wasn't a hard shove. It was the kind of shove a bully gives when he wants to start something but wants the other man to throw the first proper punch. A test, a poke at the bear to see if the bear is real. What happened next happened fast, and it was nothing like Dale expected. The soldier moved, not at Dale, away from him. In one sharp, sudden motion he came to attention, brought his rifle off his shoulder and down in front of him with a hard crack of metal and leather, and turned. His boot came down on the stone with a stamp that echoed off the castle wall, loud as a gunshot in the cold air, and his voice came out at full volume, clipped and absolute. "Make way for the King's Guard." Then he marched. 3 paces, sharp and exact, turned on the spot with another crack of his heel, and marched back. Every movement was clean and trained and completely controlled, and there was something genuinely frightening about it precisely because it was so controlled. It was the difference between a man losing his temper and a machine switching on. Dale jumped back. He couldn't help it. The whole crowd flinched. A couple of the children gasped and one of them started crying. The soldier hadn't touched Dale, hadn't even looked at him during it, but the sheer force and noise and certainty of it had knocked the swagger clean out of him for a second. And here's the thing, that was the warning. That was the whole system working exactly as it's meant to. The guard had done the regulation thing. He had given Dale and everyone a clear and unmistakable signal to step back and stop. Any sensible person takes that signal and walks away, a bit embarrassed, with a funny story for the pub. The danger was over before it began, if Dale had wanted it to be. But Dale had a camera on him, and he had a crowd watching, and he had jumped visibly on film in front of everyone. His pride, which was a small and brittle thing dressed up as something bigger, had just taken a hit, and for a man like Dale that was worse than a punch. He laughed it off too loud. "Whoa, whoa, easy, easy, soldier boy, look at him all worked up. You see that Jordan got him going now." Jordan didn't answer. Jordan had gone quiet. Jordan behind the camera had felt something Dale hadn't, because Jordan wasn't the one full of his own noise. Jordan had seen how the soldier moved, and somewhere in the back of his mind a quiet voice had started saying this is a bad idea. This is a really bad idea, but he didn't say it out loud. He just kept filming because that's what he'd come to do, and because it's hard to be the one who says stop. The soldier had returned to his position, rifle on his shoulder, eyes on the road, still as the wall behind him, as if the last 10 seconds had never happened. That stillness, coming straight after all that noise and force, was somehow the most unnerving part of all. He could do that. He could go from absolutely nothing to absolutely everything and back to nothing again in a heartbeat, and he had complete command over the switch. Dale didn't have that. Dale was either loud or he was lost. An older man near the front of the crowd watched all of this with his hands in the pockets of his coat. His name was Frank. He was in his 70s with a flat cap and a quiet face, and he'd been standing there a while before any of this started. He had the look of a man who'd seen a few things. He turned to the woman beside him and said, not loudly but loud enough that a few people heard, "That lad wants to walk away now, while he still can." A teenager near him asked why. Frank just nodded toward the soldier. "Because that one's not playing," Frank said. "I've met men like him. You don't see what they are until you make them show you, and by then it's done." But Dale wasn't walking away. Walking away now would mean the video ended with him jumping like a startled cat, and that wasn't the video he wanted. He needed to win it back. He needed the last word, the last laugh, something to cut the clip on. So he did what cornered, embarrassed bullies always do. He made it personal, and he made it cruel, because cruelty felt like strength to him and he had nothing else left to reach for. He stepped in close again, careful this time to stay just out of range, and he lowered his voice into a nasty little sneer aimed straight at the soldier's face. "You think you're hard," Dale said. "You're nothing. You stand here playing dress-up for tourists because you couldn't hack anything real. I've met blokes like you, all show. Bet you've never even been anywhere. Bet you'd wet yourself if anything actually kicked off." And it was here, with that one stupid sentence, that Dale stepped onto ground he had no idea he was standing on. Because the soldier had been somewhere. He had been a lot of somewheres. And in the small private space behind his fixed, calm face, Dale's words landed not as an insult but as something almost laughable, the noise of a child shouting at the sea. The soldier's name was Daniel. He was 29 years old. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before he ever wore this coat and this hat. And the things he had done there were not the kind of things that go in a video. He had spent a whole night once lying flat in a ditch while rounds cracked over his head close enough that he could feel the air move, learning in his bones the exact difference between noise that means nothing and noise that means you're about to die. A loud man with a phone outside a castle was noise that meant nothing. Daniel had filed it under nothing the moment Dale opened his mouth. But that wasn't the part that kept him calm. The calm came from somewhere heavier than that. In his second tour, a vehicle 3 back from his in a convoy had been hit. Daniel had been one of the first to it. He had pulled a man named Ryan out of that wreck with his own hands, with the heat coming off the metal and the world gone sideways and loud, and Ryan had been badly hurt in ways that don't heal back to the way they were. And the thing Daniel remembered most, the thing he carried, was that Ryan, lying there in the worst moment of his life, had made a joke. A bad, dry, terrible little joke about the state of his own legs, just to take the fear off the lads around him. That was the bravest thing Daniel had ever seen. A broken man thinking of the people next to him before himself. So when Dale, this loud, soft, untested man, called Daniel weak, called him all show, told him he'd never been anywhere, Daniel felt no anger at all. Anger wasn't the right size for it. What he felt, if anything, was a kind of tired patience. The patience of a man who knows exactly how small the threat in front of him is, and exactly how much it isn't worth. And here is where the whole thing turned, and where you find out what real strength actually looks like. Because it isn't what Dale thought it was, and it probably isn't what you'd expect either. Dale, getting nothing again, lost the last of his patience. The camera was rolling. The crowd was watching. He'd been ignored, he jumped like a fool, and now he was being ignored again, and the shame of it boiled over the way it always eventually did with him. He drew his arm back, and he swung. It was a wild punch. A big, looping, all-his-weight haymaker thrown with rage instead of skill, the kind of punch that looks terrifying and lands almost never, because it tells you everything it's going to do a full second before it does it. To most people in the crowd it looked fast and frightening. To the one man it was aimed at, it may as well have been thrown in slow motion. Daniel didn't step back, he stepped in. That's the thing nobody who hasn't been trained understands. The safe place isn't away from the punch. The safe place is inside it, closer than the swinging fist can reach with any force. Daniel moved off the line of the blow with a small turn of his body, so the haymaker sailed past his head and met nothing but cold air, and in the same motion he was already inside Dale's reach, already controlling the arm, already taking the much bigger man's own weight and momentum and using them against him. There was no flurry of blows, no film-style beating. It was almost gentle in how efficient it was. Daniel hooked the swinging arm, turned his hips, and Dale's own forward weight did the rest. The big man went over and down, hard, face first onto the wet stone, with Daniel riding him down and pinning the arm up behind his back in a hold that didn't break anything but made absolutely certain Dale was not getting up until he was allowed to. Dale's nose hit the ground on the way down. That was where the blood came from, not from any punch. From his own swing missing and his own weight dropping him onto the pavement he'd been swaggering across a minute before. There is something almost fair about that, when you think about it. He was undone by the exact thing he'd brought with him, the force and the size he was so proud of, turned around and laid flat by a man who knew how to do nothing more than wait and let him fall. The crowd made a single sound, a sharp gasp altogether, and then went quiet. The school party stared. Frank, the old man in the flat cap, didn't even look surprised. He just nodded slowly to himself, the way you nod when something you already knew turns out to be true. Jordan had stopped pretending to be brave. "Mate, get up, come on, get up," he was saying, but he wasn't moving any closer, and he was, you'll notice, still filming. That detail mattered later. Dale was on the ground now, cheek against the cold stone, one arm held firmly behind him, and for the first time all afternoon he had absolutely nothing to say. The voice that had filled the whole space was gone. He squirmed once, testing the hold, and the hold simply tightened a fraction to tell him no, and he stopped. He understood, finally, in his body, if not yet in his head, that he had been completely and utterly wrong about everything. About this man, about himself, about how the next 30 seconds were going to go. Daniel held him there calm, not even breathing hard, and then he spoke, not loud, just for Dale, in a low, even voice that carried no anger at all, which somehow made it land harder than any shout could have. "I've stood in places," Daniel said, "where the noise actually meant something. This isn't one of them." Dale said nothing. He couldn't. "I've carried better men than you'll ever be," Daniel went on quietly. "Men who'd been hurt in ways you can't imagine. And do you know what they did? They made jokes, to take the fear off the lads next to them. That's strength. That's what it looks like. Not this." The words went somewhere in Dale that all the shoving and the shouting never could have reached. There was nothing to argue with. There was no crowd to play to, no camera angle to win. There was just a man on the floor in the rain who had finally been shown, in the plainest possible terms, exactly how small he'd made himself. By now there was movement at the edge of the crowd. Two police officers, who are always closer to these places than people realize, were already coming through, and behind them another soldier and a color sergeant who'd seen the whole thing from the gate. Daniel held the position, steady and controlled, until the police were right there beside him, and then he handed it all over cleanly, the way it's meant to be done. He stood, stepped back, and within a few seconds had returned to his box, rifle to his shoulder, eyes forward, as if a tank could have rolled past without him so much as glancing at it. That was the part that stayed with the people who saw it, not the takedown, the way he simply switched it off and went back to being still. He hadn't enjoyed any of it. There was no triumph in him, no showing off, no looking around for applause. He'd done a thing that needed doing, exactly as much of it as was needed and not one bit more, and then he'd let it go. Dale had spent the whole afternoon desperate for attention. The man who beat him didn't want any. The police got Dale to his feet. He was a sorry sight by then, his nose bleeding down his front, his swagger gone completely, looking smaller somehow than he had when he arrived, as if all the air he'd been holding himself up with had gone out of him at once. They had him in handcuffs before he'd properly got his balance. He tried, weakly, to say it wasn't his fault, that the soldier had attacked him, that everyone had seen it. And that's when the thing he'd been so proud of turned on him one last time. "We did see it," one of the officers said, "and so did that." He nodded at Jordan and at the phone in Jordan's hand, still recording, that had captured every second. The shove, the warning, the personal, cruel taunts, and Dale's own arm drawing back and his own punch thrown first at a man who hadn't so much as looked at him wrong. The video Dale had come to make, the one that was going to show the world how hard he was, instead showed the world exactly the opposite, and it would do its showing in front of a magistrate. They led him away toward the car. He went quietly. There was nothing left in him to be loud with. Frank, the old man in the cap, watched them go. The teenager beside him asked, almost in a whisper, how the soldier had known to do that, how he'd stayed so calm with someone screaming in his face. Frank thought about it for a moment. "Loud men aren't dangerous," he said. "Loud's just loud. The dangerous ones are the quiet ones who have already seen the worst there is and decided they don't need to prove anything to you. That lad on the floor, he was all noise. That one in the hat, he was all the rest of it. Trouble is, you can't tell them apart by looking. That's the lesson, son. You never can tell by looking." The drizzle picked up again. The crowd began to drift off, talking among themselves in low voices. The children herded back toward their coach. Within 10 minutes, the gate looked exactly as ordinary as it had before any of it happened. A soldier in a gray coat, standing in the rain, doing a boring job. Tourists taking photos. The usual jokes about him being a statue. Nobody arriving would ever have guessed. And that's really the whole point of it, isn't it? Dale looked at that man and saw an easy target. He saw a costume, a toy gun, a soft bloke in a funny hat who couldn't fight back and couldn't hurt him. He looked at the surface and decided he knew everything underneath it. Because that was how Dale had always moved through the world, deciding what people were by how they looked and how loud he could be at them. He had it exactly backwards. The stillness he mistook for weakness was the most controlled thing in that whole courtyard. The silence he took as fear was a man choosing, with enormous discipline, not to do the easy and obvious thing right up until the moment he had no choice. And when that moment came, it was over in less time than it takes to tell, because real strength doesn't need to be loud, doesn't need a run-up, and never, ever needs a camera. Dale spent his whole life believing that being the biggest and the loudest in the room made him the strongest. He found out, on a cold afternoon in the rain in front of everyone, that it doesn't. It never did. So here's the question to leave you with, and it's worth actually sitting with for a second. When you picture a strong person, what do you picture? The one making all the noise, taking up all the space, daring everyone to test them? Or the one standing quietly in the corner who you'd walk straight past, who has nothing to prove because they already know exactly what they are? Dale guessed wrong. Most people do, right up until the moment the quiet one decides to show them. The trick, if there is one, is to be the kind of person who never has to ask the question of someone else, because you already understand the answer in yourself. If this story landed with you, let me know in the comments which line stuck with you the most, and subscribe so the next one finds you. Thanks for watching.